Welcome back to the deep dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're diving into a really fascinating and honestly pretty timely piece of writing. It's Alexander Grace's article called Men Should Always Pay for Women, Here's Why, Debunked.
Yeah, that one definitely sparked some conversation.
It did. Now, the original piece that Grace is responding to, it made some, let's say, bold claims like men should always pay for women.
Right. And not just based on tradition, but linking it to things like safety concerns, reproductive biology, even power dynamics.
Exactly. So our mission today is to really unpack Grace's counterpoint. He takes a very methodical approach, doesn't he?
Oh, absolutely. Fact-checking is a pretty sharp philosophical critique. Looking at the rhetoric used, he really dissects it.
So we're going to explore his arguments, kind of break down those original points through his lens, and maybe see what broader issues this whole debate touches on.
Sounds like a plan. There are definitely some surprising facts Grace brings up. It might shift how you think about some of these contemporary gender discussions.
All right, let's get into it then. Let's unpack this.
What's quite compelling about Grace's approach, I think, is that he doesn't just, dismiss the claims outright.
No, he engages with them properly.
Yeah, he leans in, takes each point seriously, systematically. It's kind of like he's inviting you to look behind the curtain of the argument, see the mechanics.
Or the lack of mechanics sometimes, maybe.
Yes. Sometimes revealing the, let's say, logical gaps.
That feels crucial. Okay, so let's start with that first big claim from the original piece. Men are women's apex predators.
A really strong statement.
Huge. And it was backed up with stats, things like 91% of rape and assault victims are women, 99% of perpetrators are men, and this figure that only 2% of rapists go to prison. How did Grace tackle those numbers?
Right, so Grace's rebuttal here is pretty direct. He argues those stats, while, often cited, can be misleading.
Misleading how?
Mainly because of historical bias in data collection. For decades, male victims of sexual assault just weren't really counted in many official data sets.
Ah, okay, so that obviously skews the picture.
Massively. And he suggests that if you start including cases where men are victims, like instances sometimes called forced to penetrate, that the gender gap in who's victimized actually narrows quite a bit.
And there's the issue of underreporting too, right? Especially for male victims.
Exactly. Huge stigma, which means the data we do have is likely incomplete anyway, further skewing things.
So the numbers themselves might not tell the full story. What about that 2% conviction rate stat?
Yeah, he debunks that one pretty firmly. He cites the U.S. Sentencing Commission, I believe.
Okay.
And according to that, absolutely. And Grace's sort of knowledge nugget here is how these outdated definitions, or maybe stats driven by a particular narrative, can really warp public understanding of something as serious as gender-based violence.
It's about definitions, who gets counted, what counts. It all matters.
It really does. It suggests we need to be, much more critical about the data presented to us, especially when it's used to build these really big, sweeping arguments. Grace is basically calling for more rigor.
Okay, so from the tricky world of statistics, Grace moves on to another claim. Men benefit from contrast to bad men and don't actually protect women.
Right. The idea being that good men only look good by comparison, and they aren't really stepping up.
How does Grace push back on that? He sees it differently.
He does. He suggests this might be a form of projection.
Projection, meaning?
Meaning attributing your own thoughts and motivations onto others. He actually points to some research suggesting that women, perhaps more often, derive self-esteem from social comparisons. It's a complex area, psychologically.
Interesting. Does he offer any, real-world examples?
He does. He mentions a social experiment. You might have seen videos like this online.
Maybe. What happened?
Well, in the setup, men did intervene when they saw a woman being publicly harassed or assaulted. Quite quickly, in fact.
Okay, so they did protect.
In that scenario, yes. But then they reversed the roles. A woman assaulting a man publicly. And according to the experiment he cites, nobody stepped in. Bystanders were much less likely to intervene. He even notes that women, specifically, were less likely to stand up for the male victim in that context.
Wow, that's quite a stark contrast.
It is, and Grace uses this to critique what he calls selective empathy. He's essentially asking, why is the narrative so often focused only on female victimhood?
And ignoring male suffering, or maybe the complexities of who protects whom.
Exactly. He's arguing for a broader view, acknowledging that victimhood and protection aren't strictly limited to one gender pattern. It's a call to see the whole picture.
Okay, this next one. This gets debated a lot. Claim 3. Men should pay because women's time is more valuable.
Ah, yes, the reproductive clock argument.
That's the one. Women have a limited window for reproduction, therefore their time, especially dating time, is inherently more valuable. Grace really dissects this, doesn't he?
He does, yeah. He basically calls it out as being selectively traditional,
Selectively traditional.
meaning the original argument invokes this idea of biological essentialism basing value purely on biological function, but only when it's convenient for this specific point about money.
Okay, so biological essentialism here means reducing someone's value or role down to their biology, like in this case, fertility.
Precisely. Grace sees it as grabbing a traditional biology-based argument to justify a modern financial expectation, like who pays for a date. It's inconsistent, in his view.
Right, like picking and choosing arguments from different eras or philosophies when it suits.
Exactly. And to highlight this inconsistency, he poses some pretty pointed counter-questions.
Like what?
Well, like, should men not pay then if they're dating older women, past reproductive age, or women who've explicitly said they don't want children?
Ah, because if the logic is purely about reproductive time.
Then it should apply consistently. Right.
Yeah.
But it often doesn't seem to. So he's critiquing this awkward blend of wanting modern feminist equality in some areas, but also holding on to traditional entitlements in others.
That makes sense. It exposes a potential double standard.
Yeah, Grace argues this kind of logic, based just on fertility, opens up a whole can of worms, really. Slippery slopes, inconsistencies. It shows the danger of just grabbing bits of tradition to fit a modern narrative without thinking it through.
Which leads us kind of naturally into the fourth claim he looks at, reproductive risks and bodily autonomy.
Right, the argument that women face all the physical, emotional, financial burdens of potential pregnancy, whereas men don't, implying some sort of compensation is due.
How does Grace respond to that one? Because the risks are real.
He acknowledges the risks, but counters the implication about men's views and responsibilities. He points out a key statistic. A majority of men, around 61%, according to research he cites, are actually pro-choice.
61%. So it's not like men are universally opposed to women's reproductive choices.
Not at all. It suggests that your stance on abortion is often better predicted by things like your politics, your religion, maybe your age, rather than just your gender. It's not a simple men versus women issue.
Okay. And then he brings up something called paper abortion. What's that about?
Yeah, this is a concept where, hypothetically, a man could legally relinquish all parental rights and responsibilities at an early stage, similar to how a woman can choose abortion.
So like opting out of fatherhood legally right at the start.
Essentially, yes. Grace points out that this idea generally lacks support, including often from women's groups. And he argues this reveals a kind of one-sided focus on autonomy.
Can you unpack that a bit? One-sided how?
Well, his core argument here is about consistency. If bodily autonomy, the right to choose what happens to your body in future, is the absolute principle,
then it should apply equally.
it must apply equally, he argues. Women currently have a legal mechanism abortion to opt out of the biological consequences of sex, pregnancy. Men, however, have no equivalent legal mechanism to opt out of the financial and legal responsibilities of paternity once conception occurs, even if they were, say, deceived about contraception or didn't want to be a father.
So he sees a disparity in the actual application of autonomy.
Yes. He argues this difference undermines the claim that the focus is purely and consistently on autonomy for everyone. It forces you to ask if the principle is being applied fairly across the board.
That's a really challenging point about consistency. Okay, fifth and final claim Grace tackles. Women's presence and attention is more valuable.
And the proofs offered for this was interesting.
Yeah, citing revenues from things like strip clubs and OnlyFans as evidence that society values women's attention more than men's.
Grace's reaction to this is pretty strong. He basically finds the idea of equating a woman's fundamental value with her ability to sexually arouse men, well, degrading.
He finds it degrading.
Deeply.
Yeah.
He even uses this ironic line, something like, wait, am I the feminist here?
Like, he can't believe he has to argue against reducing women's value to sex appeal.
Exactly. It expresses his kind of dismay at what he sees as incredibly reductionist logic presented as empowerment.
Does he offer a counter-explanation for why men might spend money in those contexts?
He does. He touches on pre-selection theory.
Pre-selection, what's that?
It's the idea from evolutionary psychology that a man seen with attractive women might gain social status or appear more desirable to other women.
Ah, okay, so the appeal isn't just men valuing women in isolation.
Right. Grace argues the dynamic is more complex. It's often about status signaling among men and appealing to other potential female partners, not just men, because women inherently have more valuable presence in some abstract sense.
And he also critiques the way this argument was presented, right? Something about the delivery.
Yes. He calls it manipulation through apathetic appeal.
Apathetic appeal.
Yeah, like delivering these, what he considers quite absurd or controversial claims in a very monotone, matter-of-fact, almost bored tone.
Why would someone do that?
The idea is it makes the claim seem obvious, like common sense that doesn't even need debating. It's a rhetorical trick to kind of bypass your critical thinking. If they say it so blandly, maybe it's just true.
That's a subtle but powerful technique. Makes it harder to challenge.
Definitely. And once you sort of recognize it, you might start noticing it in other debates too. Presenting something wild as if it's just Tuesday afternoon.
So all these critiques lead Grace to coin a specific term, right? The Schrodinger's feminist.
Yes, that's his term. It's his way of summarizing what he sees as the fundamental incoherence in the original speaker's overall position.
Okay, unpack Schrodinger's feminist for us. What does he mean?
He argues the speaker seems to flip-flop between identities, depending on the argument. One minute, she's the modern boss babe, totally independent, doesn't need anyone.
Right.
And the next minute, when it suits the point about who should pay or provide, she might lean into being the traditional nurturer, emphasizing conventional gender roles or vulnerabilities.
So she's kind of both and neither at the same time, depending on what narrative is useful at that moment, like Schrodinger's cat being both alive and dead until observed.
That's the analogy, exactly.
Yeah.
Grace concludes there isn't really a consistent underlying principle guiding the arguments.
Other than,
in his view, what seems to offer personal gain or advantage in that specific instance, often, he suggests, while framing men negatively. It's about leveraging whichever identity or narrative works best for the desired outcome, not philosophical consistency.
this really helps tie together the different strands of his critique, and it points to some bigger themes he highlights throughout. Like you mentioned projection earlier.
Yes, that's a big one for him. Attributing your own biases or ways of thinking onto the other gender. He sees that repeatedly in the original claims, like saying men do X, when maybe the speaker's own thinking reflects X.
Okay. And then contradiction?
Right. Using selective logic, ignoring how one argument clashes with another. We saw that with the women's time is valuable, point, the logic falls apart if you apply it universally.
And finally, what he termed gendered entitlement.
Yeah. This is the idea of arguing for equality, but maybe only when it confers a benefit, while perhaps rejecting equality when it comes with a responsibility or cost, demanding rights without accepting corresponding duties from his perspective.
So when you put it all together, Grace isn't just arguing about who picks up the check, is he?
Not at all. He frames this whole thing as a symptom of a much deeper ideological battle.
About what?
About accountability, about fairness, about how we even talk about gender relations in society today. Are we being honest? Are we being consistent?
And he warns against certain tactics.
Very clearly. He warns against using emotional manipulation, using those cherry-picked or misleading stats to push what he sees as a narrative skewed towards female victimhood and sometimes male villainy.
So his article is doing double duty, really. It's a fact check on specific claims.
And it's also a broader critique of the culture, of the way these conversations happen.
It's not just deconstructing points, but challenging the whole framework, the rhetoric, the biases that shape how we discuss gender now. It sounds like a call for more intellectual honesty.
That's exactly it. A call for consistent standards, applying the same logic, the same ethical scrutiny to everyone involved in the discussion, regardless of gender.
Well, we hope this deep dive has given you a clearer picture of these really complex arguments around gender, money, autonomy, accountability, all of it.
It's definitely a reminder, isn't it, about how important critical thinking is when we encounter information, especially online, and especially on topics that stir up strong emotions.
Absolutely. This look into Grace's work really underscores that call for consistency in how we talk about gender, urging us all really to question the assumptions, look past the surface claims, check the data.
Yeah, don't just accept the narrative. Dig a little deeper.
So thinking about all this, what does it mean for you listening right now? How might understanding these kinds of arguments, spotting projection or contradiction, or maybe that selective entitlement Grace talks about, how might that help you navigate the sheer amount of information and debate out there?
What really stands out to you from this whole discussion we've unpacked today, it's certainly a lot to think about.